Ellen Chesler, Senior Fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, author of now, I'm proud to say, 20-year in-print biography of Margaret Sanger, which incorporates a long history of the birth control movement in America. I thought I could stop talking about this issue a long time ago, but it seems to be coming back with a vengeance.
I think we're both going to be talking about this for the rest of our lives.
And you, Michelle, who are you?
And my name is Michelle Goldberg. I'm a writer for Newsweek and the Daily Beast, and I'm the author most recently of a book called The Means of Reproduction, Sex, Power, and the Future of the World. And so right before we started recording, we were talking about Romney's comments on Monday to a girl who wanted, or a woman, a young woman in one of his audiences who wants her contraception.
In Peoria, Illinois, the heartland of America, home of Betty Friedan, actually, patron saint of second-wave feminism. And there you go. Romney said to her in no uncertain terms, if you want the government to pay for your contraception, you got to vote for the other guy. And I think that was a game changer. 20 million women under the Affordable Care Act will have not only contraception covered, but also they will be assured of health insurance coverage for a range of primary preventive health care services like pap smears and others, such things. Those who pay for their own insurance on the private market will have that coverage, but this means also that those who receive some support, either through Medicaid or through Title X or through some subsidy of...
Right. Well, he runs to end Title X.
But you know, as people who don't understand this, that the big gain will be, there will be big gains in Medicaid, and there will be big gains under this Health Insurance Act in subsidy of middle-income people who can't afford to pay for private insurance.
But you know, I'm not sure how much. I would like to think it was a game change, and I mean, certainly it's not going to help him narrow the gender gap, and there was something so supercilious in the way he kind of sneered at her as if she was asking for some kind of desperate handout because she wants her kind of basic medications to be covered by health insurance the way medications are covered by health insurance for men. But at the same time, you know, I think that these issues get really confusing for people, I think, especially because healthcare reform hasn't kicked in yet, so people don't exactly know, people don't exactly understand what it means. I mean, the very fact that he kind of said, well, if you want free stuff that you're not going to pay for, that the government's going to pay for, you know, none of this has ever really been about the government paying for anything. It's about insurance, which, especially if you have a job, is part of you're paying for it. You know, it's part of your compensation package.
But some people will get subsidies.
I think there's so much.
That's what all the concern is about, and certainly it's a concern with respect to Catholic-supported medical institutions and universities. Again, a lot of confusion there because the Republicans keep saying that we're somehow treading on the church. Churches are exempt. What aren't exempt is church-related institutions in the medical field, right, which serve now about 1 in 5 American women. So we're talking about a lot of women. And many of them not Catholic. So it's always important to get down to these details. But I guess the reason I think it's a game changer is because I think that the Obama campaign, supported by many, many women's organizations around the country, with Planned Parenthood in the lead, is going to just focus in on this and is already messaging in a way, in an aggressive way that hasn't been done before. And these things have not clicked in yet in terms of the time, the clock of implementation of the Affordable Care Act. They're on board for this fall 2012 or August 2012, which is before the campaign. I mean,
it's also
which is a very important point.
Right. It's also interesting that, you know, things like that, I think, Romney seems to desperately want this issue to go away. You know, I think his campaign just said something today that we're probably going to be hearing about until November, when they said something like the primary is like an Etch-a-Sketch and you can kind of shake it and start over, which was an implication that they kind of don't see anything that they've said these last few months as particularly binding. But I think other people rightly will. And so it seems like that, you know, you can kind of play that quote over and over and over again, as they probably will, and kind of make him take a position on these issues that he really would prefer to never talk about.
Well, or prevent him from, in fact, seesawing on the issues and just completely changing his mind, which is the way he's run in the past, and trying to get the press to say, well, I had to say that in the primary because it was a condition of my getting elected because I had to appeal to conservative voters, but in fact, I've changed my mind. And, I don't know that he's going to be allowed to get away with that kind of constant shifting.
Although I actually think he kind of benefits among certain moderate women who maybe have never prioritized these kinds of things, but have been somewhat outraged by, this whole succession of things, from kind of the Komen Foundation to Rush Limbaugh, but who are fundamentally more concerned about the economy. I've always thought that he kind of benefits.
Well, I must say I respectfully disagree because I think the message that's really getting out clearly is that you can't distinguish social issues from the economy. 50% of the...
Oh, no, I think you're right. No, absolutely. But I guess my point is that I think that there are moderates who support Romney because they believe that all this kind of social conservative, because they basically say he doesn't believe all this social conservative stuff. He's just saying it to get through the primary. I think what that misses is that he's actually making kind of certain binding promises to a party that he's going to need to keep behind him, and so he's going to need to kind of pay back in certain ways, should he ever become
also
president.
We have to remind those swing voters in the center, and they will determine the outcome of the election, and they are largely women, many of them single women, that we've heard all this before, because the same thing happened in 2000 in the Bush-Gore race when Bush kept saying, well, I didn't really mean any of it, and I'm really a moderate on these issues. But then the minute he got into office was beholden over and over again.
Well, when did he say, I thought he kind of said he was a moderate, but to me the difference was that he didn't so much kind of disavow earlier positions so much as he spoke in kind of two registers, right? So
abstractions. He would speak in a sort of,
right. In abstractions or else in a sort of code. So he would say, he would talk about the horror of the Dred Scott decision in a way that made it clear to the anti-abortion movement that he was using it as an analogy for Roe versus Wade, but in a way that kind of went over the head of people who, rightly kind of don't pay that much attention.
Well, but without getting too much down in the weeds about an election 12 years ago, there are those who have analyzed the outcome of the 2000 election and suggested that in places like New Mexico, where Gore won, and certainly in Florida, where the outcome of the election was quite uncertain, but there are those of us who think Gore also won. The real change and the reason why the Republicans were so surprised was a shift in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the race by independent women who watched ads, actually, which were heavily targeted in those states, that suggested they shouldn't trust Bush on women's issues and actually voted on those issues. The major challenge for women and for progressives on women's issues is that, as you pointed out, women are generally not valence voters on these issues. They will prioritize economic issues or national security issues over them. And I think what's happening in the race this year that is different is that they're coming to understand how the two are so intimately linked. That if you are a working woman in America today, government protection of your right to have contraception covered by your insurance carrier, whether it's a private one or whether it involves a government subsidy, is critical to your economic well-being and the economic well-being of your family. There's no small irony in the fact that we are having this conversation at a time when Time magazine is running a cover story this week based on a new book which shows that among young people in coupled families where there are two incomes, there are now more women out earning their husbands than ever before, and then.
Wait, well, let me ask you this: do you think that it's an irony that we're talking about these two things simultaneously, or do you think that those kind of underlying changes in the gender order are part of the reason that this stuff is
absolutely? I think it's the long-term reason, and I think 80% of the country is comfortable with these long-term structural changes in basic organization of families in patriarchy, if you want to put it even more generally, but 20% of the country is not, and they form the base of the Republican Party. Now they're all in one party. That didn't used to be the case, as I've written about in many places over many years. It used to be that there were conservatives among the Democrats, particularly in the South, and Northern Catholics. There was a major shift, as you and I have discussed many times, in 1980, in the Reagan years, when the Republicans, going after votes, figured that they had an opportunity to essentially erode the basic coalition of the New Deal Democrats, a coalition of Northern Catholic working people and Southern conservatives around two issues. One issue was race, and one issue was gender, and discomfort among some of those who were conservative with some of the major rights changes of the 1960s and 70s, and particularly around abortion. The debate has intensified in recent years to cover contraception, sex education, a whole host of things, because as the rights became more well established in the 1990s with the election of Bill Clinton as your first pro-choice president, the right became stronger and stronger in its efforts to come back at these issues, and the backlash intensified, propelled by huge amounts of money that were poured into the conversation by right-wing foundations. I mean, it's a phenomenon that has not had enough narrative. I mean, I've written about it, others have written about it, you've written about it, and it's a phenomenon that not only hasn't had a sufficient narrative in terms of the U.S. implications, but around the world. I mean, this was absolutely true, because so much of this backlash, which was quite, intentionally supported by conservative foundations, was focused not only in the United States, but on developments around the world.
So, but you said before that you think 80% of the country is kind of comfortable with these changes. I mean, that seems kind of sanguine to me, because, well, first of all, because, it's only, I think, it's a fairly elite segment of men that seems kind of comfortable, with kind of greater involvement in childcare and kind of more egalitarian partnerships. I mean, I think from the left and the right, you see some discussion of kind of a broader crisis among
I actually think that
men who've seen their status challenged at the same time as the kind of economic foundations of their lives.
Again, maybe it's the differences in our age, and I mean, I have to continue to be optimistic as I get older, because otherwise I can't continue to do this work. And I'm a whole generation older than you are, and I've been at this battle a long time. But I actually think, or maybe it's just my temperament's different, but I actually think that there's a fair amount of social science research now that supports my view that more and more people are growing comfortable with this. I mean, first of all, companionate marriages seem to be happier marriages. There's less divorce. The shared responsibility for work and family between men and women seems to be making everybody happier. I was just at the cusp of the revolution in women's work. Women had always worked, but they worked episodically until 1970s and 80s, early in their lives, before marriage, or once their children were grown. My generation was the generation that really changed that. I think you and I have discussed this before too, but it's not until 1980, relatively recent in history, that in the United States Census more women self-identified as workers than as homemakers, but that now is predominant. I mean, we have 3 months of unpaid family and medical leave, but by and large, 75% of the children in American schools have mothers who work. Many more women go back to work immediately after childbirth. So contraception is a sine qua non of this economic revolution as well as social revolution. And if you take a look at polls, you see a particular contempt for the Republican position among young people. So that the future is really with us. I'm, as you know, on the board of Planned Parenthood, and I've seen numbers that are astonishing in terms of the support for Planned Parenthood, which has, of course, been the whipping girl, so to speak, of the Republicans.
Well, I think, one of the things that I think that we have to be kind of grateful to the current crop of Republicans for is that, for a long time, there was these attacks on abortion that people who, kind of pro-choice people would try to say the logical endpoint of this is an attack on contraception, right? Like, it's a slippery slope. They're talking about late-term abortion now.
They really are after
these kind of encroachments have no end. And, and if you go after the legal foundation of Roe versus Wade, you're not just going after Roe versus Wade, you're also going after Griswold versus Connecticut. But I think that this was a somewhat hard case to make. Because people thought that access to birth control, it seemed so far beyond the realm of political debate. And I think that they have done us a big favor by making their agenda so incredibly clear. And it's been interesting to me how shocked a lot of women in this country are. I mean, I guess it should have been clear to me that, if you don't kind of follow this stuff day in and day out professionally, maybe it's not, the scope of their radicalism isn't totally clear. But, the sense of that women just literally cannot believe what's happening. And also that I think that Republicans really got ahead of themselves, not just Republicans, kind of anti-abortion movement got ahead of itself by assuming that because there is a lot of ambivalence towards abortion, that extended beyond the boundaries of abortion.
I mean, which is actually also a falsehood, because if you ask people whether they're for abortion, of course most people say no, they're not for abortion. But if you ask them whether they want it criminalized, only 19% of Americans will respond and say they want it criminalized.
I think that's a problem with a lot of polling around this issue, right? The polling around this issue is almost never starts with the question, should abortion be criminalized?
And that's why it appears that support for abortion is eroded when, in fact, it's not clear to me that it has. The dial has never switched on that. It's been the same since Roe v. Wade. I mean, more people might now be unwilling to accept the pro-choice label. After all, we've had 40 years, or almost 40 years now, of stigmatizing it. But ask that basic question, okay, do you want us to take away your right? Do you want to make it a criminal act for the doctors who perform abortions and for the women who have them? And hardly anybody will say yes. And again, even there in the right wing, young people who have self-identify even as evangelicals and people with faith are beginning to have doubts about all of this.
Well, is that true? Because a lot of the polling I've seen has shown that younger people are actually becoming more uncomfortable with abortion than they were, say, 15 or 20 years ago. And again, my sense is that there's two pieces to that. I mean, one, I think, is just the simple fact of better ultrasound technology and coupled with kind of propaganda that would make you think that kind of most abortions are at 6 months or something.
And of course, 90% of them are in the first 8 weeks.
Right, when it looks nothing like anything that you've ever seen on a
blastocyte
poster outside of it.
Not a fetus at all.
But also I think that, the further and further you get away from illegal abortion, the more it becomes an abstraction, and the more the question is heard is not should abortion be illegal, but do you like abortion?
But again, I think your point is the one that is most salient, which is that we have the Republicans to thank for outing themselves in terms of their real agenda, or at least these very conservative Republicans. And Romney has simply, fallen into this trap. I don't know whether he is unaware. I mean, sometimes he does strike me as just sort of living in a meta reality where he doesn't really understand the significance of these issues. In the same way he talked about his wife's 2 Cadillacs, he just doesn't understand what the cost of contraception on a monthly basis means to people who live and work, on or at the, or just above the poverty line. The cost of $30 a month, or perhaps more now, I mean, in some places, is really problematic.
Right. And there's so much callousness, too, about, you can get free condoms anywhere, or you can get generics for $5 at Walmart. And, again, I think that this kind of callousness, which you hear from a lot of, you hear it both from men in Congress, you certainly hear it from kind of radio talk show hosts or people on Fox News. My guess is that women who might not even be particularly politicized around these issues, but know very well that kind of one pill isn't just as good as another, and that it's not kind of okay to switch to condoms because you can't afford your
or the aspirin between your knees comment. I mean, the insensitivity has been profound. The optics of the hearing that everyone has talked about on and on in Congress, but you kind of wonder how that could happen in in today's world. And it is, I think, a wake-up call to American women about just how out of touch our representatives often are, and how undemocratic, fundamentally undemocratic our House and Senate have become, and not reflective of the majority of opinions.
Wait, can I ask you a question? Are you surprised that this has all come roaring back right now?
Well, no, because again, I mean, while we've talked about this long-term shift in both the social structure and economic structure of American families and American life, there's also, history is always overdetermined. You have to have these long-term causes, but there are also some short-term causes which are important. And the one we've talked about, the change in the construction of parties, is been so significant. And with the, increasing significance of this minority base of the Republican Party to its governing majority, you have a situation where the party has fallen captive. It's a structural issue in American partisan politics, so that you basically have a situation where one party has fallen captive to a minority point of view, and a candidate can elect a candidate without that minority, or can't nominate a candidate, but the candidates they nominate can't be elected. I mean, this did happen, remember, even one could argue, in 1972 with the Democrats.
With the Democrats, yeah, of course. But you know what? But the thing is that the Democrats, I mean, because they have McGovern, that did precipitate a certain realignment, or at least kind of precipitate.
Well, absolutely, but this will probably get me in trouble as a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, but I've always been a bit sympathetic to Bill Clinton, who understood that he needed to recreate the New Deal coalition that the Republicans had so, determinedly and successfully eroded by going after some of these issues. I mean,
But I guess what worries me about this upcoming election is that, if Mitt Romney wins, it's obviously catastrophic for these issues, for the issues that you and I care about. But I also think it's kind of catastrophic for these issues if he loses, because he's not the kind of Republican McGovern, that Rick Santorum would be. That the lesson the party is going to take from his loss would be that they made a mistake in not nominating a true believer. And that it just shows that they need to double down on their ideology. I think the Republican
establishment will really reassert itself and come to understand that they simply cannot allow themselves to get captive to this kind of conversation. I mean, it's destroying the party. And
but
it's interesting because
the
other
do right now.
This week that I was so startled by was Karen Santorum, who stood up on Tuesday and said, now, I mean, in a kind of desperate way, well, don't worry, don't about my husband, you can trust him, he's not going to do anything about this. Well, then what's the point of all that he said? If he's the man of conscience, and he's not going to do anything, he's sort of damned, she damned him in a different way. As some of his conservative attackers have already said, but look, you voted for all this when you were in the House, or in the Senate.
Well, I think that, part of his point so far is that he's talked about wanting to use the presidency as maybe a bully pulpit to talk about the evils of contraception, but he's not necessarily going to take any legislative or executive action to try to ban contraception.
But, I think Americans aren't going to buy that, that sort of notion that, he's the president, so if he's not going to stand behind his convictions, why are we electing him? Thank goodness, I'm all for, these people destroying themselves with this crazy kinds of comments, but I think they really are doing it. I think, we're very fortunate to have a Republican primary, which is not as has happened, I think, on the Democratic side between Hillary Clinton and Obama, where Obama emerged empowered by the primary and kind of looking good as a result of the challenge, and therefore was able to win. I think quite the opposite has happened here. Obama got lucky in his opposition too, because of Sarah Palin. But needless to say, I think Romney has a much bigger hill to climb when he emerges, which I suspect he will, victorious out of this primary.
Right.
I do want to say one thing, and it's a point that you've been writing about, and that I admire so much, your reporting in Newsweek and in the Daily Beast. What while I'm relatively optimistic as a result of what's gone on this year, or certainly much more optimistic than I was at the beginning of the primary, that we can possibly pull this out and that women will pull it out for Obama. I'm certainly hoping that's the case. And while I also think that I want to thank the Republicans for allowing us to get some religion in the Democratic Party on these issues, because we didn't have it before. I mean, if there's anything really that we can be thankful for, it's that they have forced the Democrats to stand behind women on these issues. And they were always afraid of them, but they've now...
Right, and they've taught the Democrats that these are winning issues for them.
They've taught them exactly that. But while that's true at a national level, I am concerned about what's going on in state legislatures, which remain in the hands of conservatives in many, many places, and where even as national policies are being passed to expand coverage of primary health care in many respects, but particularly with respect to contraception, they are simply eroding the possibility of that happening by gutting Medicaid, for example, in Texas, and by simply not standing behind the programs, which, as you understand, but many people don't, do have a state contribution. I mean, the state has to support Medicaid from local revenues. It's a matched program. So without that participation by states, whatever happens at the federal level could still be imperiled. Now we'll have to wait and see, how this all works out. But the Republicans are being more successful at a local level at actually imperiling the Affordable Care Act, because whatever it says, if they don't participate in terms of some of the subsidy, at least for those women who do need public subsidy, there's poor women particularly are still going to be hurt.
And I mean, I know we're going to wrap this up in a minute, but I think that Texas is a place to look if you kind of really don't believe that that there is actually a substantive war on kind of contraception and family planning, as opposed to just this kind of same old abortion politics. I mean, it's fascinating and harrowing to see what happened in Texas, where you had this program, the Women's Health Program, which covered family planning and reproductive health care for women who didn't qualify for Medicaid, but would have qualified for Medicaid if they were pregnant. So it kind of says, well, if before you're pregnant, we'll help you with family planning if that's what you want. And so, when we're talking about women who make like $4,000 or $5,000 a year, and so these are, if you make $4,000 or $5,000 a year, then $30 a month for birth control pills, or $60 sliding scale fee to go to a public clinic, that is a huge overwhelming expense. So this program, which was a 9-to-1 federal match, $9 from the federal government for every $1 put up by Texas, so a huge money saver for Texas. They are about to put an end to it because they're legally not allowed to cut out Planned Parenthood, because under federal Medicaid law you have the right to choose your own provider. And what's amazing about this is that Texas has kind of split its Planned Parenthood affiliates in half. So there's 14 clinics that do abortion that are completely untouched by any of this. And then there's 51 clinics that do other sorts of family planning and reproductive health services. And they're the ones that are completely under attack. And these are organizations with separate bank accounts, separate boards. And so, kind of as we speak, you're going to have women all over Texas who are being cut off from reproductive health care. It's amazing. It's kind of, so on the one hand, it's easy.
Well, it's ironic though, because abortion isn't being imperiled because the state doesn't pay for it anyway.
Right. Abortion isn't right. Abortion is kind of completely.
So we'll have more abortions and less family planning. That's really it serves our purposes, doesn't it? I mean, it's the ironies are so extraordinary here, and the hypocrisy.
Right, but it also means that, and it also I think is important to keep in mind, because it's sometimes easy to be kind of a little bit gleeful about what the Republicans are doing to themselves as a national party, but they're still able to do profound damage to real people's lives.
But hopefully there might be a shift at the local level too. I mean, there was a moment when Democrats controlled most of the state legislatures, even in some of the borderline or, states that
the important thing about the women's health...
And then it shifted back.
Right. Well, the important thing about the women's health program is that it was instituted under Rick Perry, so it's not as if this is kind of a result of a partisan realignment. It's a result of this was okay for Republicans in 2007. Republicans in 2012 are kind of a different entity entirely.
Well, again, I mean, it may be a desperate attempt and a misread of the body politic. I mean, you go back to the whole conversation about church-state. I do believe. I mean, people say to me, "Well, how could they believe that?" I mean, that's a winning issue. But I think there remain men in politics who are so removed from the reality of most women's lives generally, and the lives of most families, who live in such a bubble that they don't understand that people see right through that issue and absolutely will privilege and vote on their concerns about women's health.
I mean, honestly, it's perfectly clear to me how they could see the world that way. And, to a certain extent, we all live in our own bubbles, right? There was that famous quote from Joan Didion where she couldn't believe that Nixon won because nobody she knew voted for him. Nobody I knew really voted for George W. Bush, but, the people I know are not very representative. But I think beyond that, I think that the demonization campaign against Planned Parenthood has been so relentless that sometimes I even forget. When there was this huge backlash against the Komen Foundation, it was this moment where I think a lot of people who felt, defensive for a long time suddenly realized, no, Planned Parenthood is a beloved
strategically,
institution in this country.
Giving the enemy a name was a terrible misstep by the Republicans when they were against Title X, when they were against government funding. But the minute people, understood Planned Parenthood, it took on a different meaning, and the polling is astonishing. I mean, this is an organization which enjoys overall in this country over a 70% approval rating, and when you control for gender or age, the numbers just run off the page. They're 80-20 in support of it. It's been around a long time, and 1 in every 5 women in America will at one point in their lifetimes use it. And people say that it's I think it's 1 in every 4 women will use it, 1 in every 5 women who vote, because some of the poor women who use it and most rely on it don't vote. But it's an that's a big number, and people don't understand how many women currently, even before the Obama healthcare Act.
I mean, that's about as many women as go to evangelical.
Right, that's exactly right. That's a good point. I want to say, too, that we're very fortunate to have leadership in the reproductive health movement in this country that the likes of which we've never had before. I mean, that would, in my view, is Sanger's biographer, maybe even include the visionary and very, very capable founder, because Cecile Richards is just a genius, as she was just called. I saw her last night on the NBC Nightly News, and she had a line that I'd love to close this conversation with. And it was the line in which she said is, look, the bottom line is that women are understanding that Republicans are shaming women. Shame is a very, very troubling term. I mean, it's about shaming women. That's what this is all about. And the women of America, particularly at this juncture in our history, with so many of us not only in the economy and benefiting our families, but also the growth of our country and of the world, aren't going to stand for it.
I hope that you're right. I think that you are. Should we end it there?
That's a good point to end it on. Again, I mean, I don't want to sound Pollyannish, and this requires a huge amount of work. If there are any particularly young men and women watching this this conversation, we need to get out there and work to reelect President Obama, and also to hold on to the Senate for Democrats, hugely important, particularly because of the Supreme Court, and possibly flip the House, which I must say I had a conversation with former President Bill Clinton, who was very skeptical about all this earlier in the year, who's feeling much more optimistic about these politics, and largely because of these issues.
Well, good. That's very
Okay.
comforting.
Well, nice to talk to you, Michelle.
All right. Yeah, you
Talk
too.
to you
Thank you
soon.
so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.